Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a game that we've covered for quite some time now. From its pre-release date, to its PS5 release, to PC, to PS5 Pro, the PS5 Pro Enhanced PSSR update. It's been a lot, and the game is coming out soon on Switch 2 and Xbox, as was announced a few months ago. But in advance of that release, we have a demo to look at, covering the first 2 chapters of the game on Switch 2 and Xbox Series. Now, I've played my fair share of Rebirth, including this demo experience on Switch 2, and I did cover the first remake installment on Switch 2 and Xbox, but my colleague Tom Morgan is the one who's really done the legwork today, done all the comparisons, done all the caps, really put in the elbow grease in this one, and he's here to report back from his experiences on Switch 2 and on the Xboxes. So Tom, take it away.
Thanks, Oliver. Yeah, good to get into this one, and it's a bit of a surprise as well, like a hugely generous demo with so much content packed in there, the first 2 chapters. Worth stressing that obviously being a demo, things may change. And obviously, as far as Switch 2 is concerned, we're looking at a handheld version essentially. So I don't know, we've talked about this before, Oliver, but the expectations have to be managed. It's a game that's made for the PS5 and Xbox Series X generation. And going into that, you'd expect it to be cut back more severely than Remake before it, just owing to the greater ambition of those open regions that they've added to the game. The other thing to say is that we have an interview with the director of the Remake trilogy himself, Naoki Hamaguchi, who kindly offered us a bunch of answers, really good answers to a few questions about the Switch 2 version specifically. And to get access to that interview, do check out digitalfoundry.net.
This video is sponsored by MSI. To mark the launch of Diablo 4 and the new Lord of Hatred expansion, MSI is launching a new giveaway featuring a one-of-a-kind custom PC. The grand prize is based on MSI's AG series of gaming desktops. This Diablo-themed system is a bespoke design built especially for this campaign, meaning it's entirely exclusive and will not be made available anywhere else. In addition to the custom AG's desktop, the prize pool also includes a secondary tier of rewards, with MSI giving away 100 digital game codes for Diablo 4 Lord of Hatred. The entry process is straightforward, and there are several ways to increase your chances of winning. By completing specific activities on the giveaway page, you can earn additional entries into the draw. Hit the link in the video description below to find the official page and read through the full requirements. Diablo 4 Lord of Hatred is available to play right now.
Let's start off here with the Switch 2, which is probably where the meat of our interest is in this game, because Xbox Series is maybe a bit more predictable than Switch 2. Switch 2 is a platform that we're still kind of figuring out. The approach that developers take differs a little bit from game to game. Obviously, we did see Remake on Switch 2, and there I think we basically saw kind of PS4 class visual settings, but with the enhancements that we saw on the PS5 versions of Remake. So those integrated visual changes with all the enhanced lighting effects looked very good there. But I think Rebirth is a very different game, like you pointed out. It's a game that's designed from the ground up for the PlayStation 5 system. It's a game with massive open views. It's a game that has stunning battles with big particles and all kinds of crazy stuff that probably would not be possible on a PlayStation 4, at least not readily possible. And it's also a title that takes advantage of the PS5's enhanced storage, loads super quick. It's maybe not the most keen game visually from the perspective of the lighting, but certainly in terms of the game's overall scope, very impressive game.
Yeah.
So what kind of experience are we getting on Switch 2, given that I think we have to assume that the downgrades they're going to make for this game are probably a little bit bigger than what we saw with Remake, right? So how does it fare on Switch 2 overall relative to that PlayStation 5 version?
Right, so I did the comparisons with base PS5 to start, and I think it's a good way to kind of get an idea of where things have been scaled back first. I'll get to Series S comparisons to Switch 2 a bit later. But yeah, the good news, I guess, to start is that the fundamentals are there. You've got all the content, basically, from what I can see in the first 2 chapters, is there. The blueprint, the mesh of the world is all present. And visually speaking, it's pushing more than I'd expected to. So I'll get the good stuff out of the way first before we get into the rougher points, which there are some. Ambient occlusion is included. Screen space reflections included. Running at a lower quality than PS5's in its quality mode. So you get puddles, varnished countertops, large water bodies, all with an SSR effect layered in there. You get distant environmental elements like flying ships, waterfalls, windmills, which still animate a good range, and all those things cast according like dynamic shadows to the ground. Object physics all kept in place. That's a kind of a fundamental tentpole part of the game design. And the NPC count is an interesting one. What they've done is they've used decimated animations on NPCs past a certain distance. So in fact, they'll come to a complete standstill and freeze frame.
We also saw that on the Switch 2 version of Remake, actually, where at a kind of relatively close distance from the camera, they just totally freeze in place. Yeah. So they would look totally still. Yeah.
And that's how it works on PS5 and Series X in their performance modes as well for Rebirth. So Switch 2 reverts to that. Otherwise, it's all intact. Animation in cutscenes flows exactly as it did before, and the world design is also identical. So shall we get into the rough points?
Yeah, let's talk about some of those points that don't scale so well, because I think with this title, actually, what we're tending to see, and I'm not sure if you agree with me on this, but I think we're seeing a lot of kind of quantitative cuts to game's visuals. A lot of things where, like, you know, models are getting decreased in quality, or the resolution's getting decreased, shutter resolution, things like this, that I'm sure you can go into some detail on. But, like, the overall visual character of the game, those kind of more qualitative changes, it's mostly been preserved, right? Because we do have this fear with some current generation console titles that they have these really advanced lighting systems that just will not scale to Switch 2 for whatever reason, right? Whether that's CPU, GPU, compute bandwidth, whatever, right? We end up in a situation where these games just look radically different on Switch 2, or could potentially look radically different on Switch 2. And I think we're not really seeing so much of that in this case.
I still think it's a good-looking package taken at a distance, but when you get close, you realize, oh, this is obviously quite rough. So, textures, we've got to say it, the textures in this and Series S, which we'll get to, pretty rough. Like, there's a lot of close-ups of the ground in cutscenes, and it's hard to ignore how mushy and pixelated the assets they're using are, partly owed, obviously, due to the limited space of a Switch 2 download. I think there's, you'll be downloading it, but it's still, I imagine they want to restrict it. And also memory allocation there as well is limited compared to the PS5 and Series X big boy consoles. So their textures have taken a hit. But let's be honest, like, I went back to the PS5 version on this to get the comparison footage, and it was never astounding, really, was it? It was there was some pretty rough texture assets in the PS5 version as well. But yeah, it goes on like that, basically. Shadows are really, on first glance, pretty rough, but then you see the PS5 version up close and you think, oh yeah, the PS5 also had these very jagged interior shadows, character casting shadows, objects casting shadows. Anything too close up, it's very low resolution. But the big difference for Switch 2 is the draw distance on the shadows. There's a cascade, a filtering point, where the shadow detail becomes fizzly and breaks up. And that's much more generous on PS5. And what we end up with on Switch 2 is kind of a lot of specklings, fizzling artifacts where shadows will appear eventually. But yeah, this is all expected stuff. It's just how things have turned out. There's a few other things in like calm, for example. Animating foliage and trees are now static across the city. They've removed object detail, bookshelves in inns and houses, like Tifa's place especially, but also the shops around Calm have just less detail. So it's more barren, but it's not like aggressively so. It's pretty acceptable for what it is. If we move to the open grasslands area, there's also stuff like lower water quality. There's a lower quality mesh with less precise ripple simulations. So that's there. Volumetric effects also pruned back. There's a lot of dithering. When you look at like the tunnel that connects Calm to the open grasslands area, gosh, it's quite rough.
But beyond your kind of subjective appraisals of these kinds of phenomena, I think you had some comment from the game director himself on these kinds of cutbacks on Switch 2, isn't that right, Tom?
Yeah, and it's a lot mostly to do with the open world format, which is a real concern. So there have been some unique optimisations, which I asked him about, and the quote goes, "In Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the scale of the world is vastly different from that of Intergrade, so we couldn't approach it in the same way. While with Intergrade we were able to achieve 30 FPS through adjustments to post-processing effects and fog, in Rebirth, the open world environment led to a significantly higher number of rendered meshes compared to integrate, making it impossible to apply that same method directly. So he says that for the Switch 2 version, the background models themselves have been optimized specifically for the hardware. This wasn't just a simple reduction, it includes redesigning the LED stages and reworking material expressions with high rendering costs from the ground up. Across the entire scenes, we also adjusted the scale at which background LEDs switch, ensuring that system load doesn't spike suddenly even as the draw distance increases. So yeah, a lot to take in there, but LEDs, meshes seem to be a pretty big focus for how they handled the open world stuff.
I think that's reflected in the final game, where you do end up seeing like there is a lot of pop-in on the PS5 version of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And on Switch 2, I think you really see that phenomenon exacerbated, where like all of a sudden that pop-in is happening much, much closer to the game camera. And in general, models are not quite as detailed, maybe geometrically a little bit simpler. There are some examples that you have here of like apples in a cart or something like that, some fruit in a cart. It looks like extremely angular.
Low quality vegetables.
Right. It looks extremely angular on Switch 2 in kind of this bizarre way. I think it is tomatoes, actually.
Yeah.
Now that I'm looking at tomatoes and cucumbers. And it's very, very angular on Switch 2, which is, not the best. It kind of reminds me of like the low poly dog in Final Fantasy 13.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, they're definitely cut back quite a bit, but at least they, for the most part, I think if you weren't looking at the PS5 version, they wouldn't stand out too much outside of like some tables that are totally bereft of decoration, adornment, props, whatever on Switch 2 now. And then of course like some really conspicuously low poly models. I don't think it stands out too much. Now maybe on like a big 4K display it stands out a bit more, but like, I don't know, these are the kind of quantitative changes that I think don't look too bad on the whole, but they do exacerbate some existing issues with the game that we noted on PS5, like it's pretty bad pop-in for foliage and things like that. All that stuff is worse, but they also seem to rein that in by just decreasing foliage density quite a bit. So it's like that two-pronged hit there in terms of visual quality.
To speak on the LED quality in the open world a bit more, they've said they've custom tailored the LED ranges just for Switch 2, and that it includes mesh shading. Apparently, according to Hamaguchi, this is a crucial factor in making the Switch 2 version work. It was like a do or die situation for the port in its entirety. So they have got that going. So I guess we should talk on image quality. It's interesting, and they've been very open about the ranges that they use. It's using a similar setup to integrate on Switch 2, I believe, for the docked play.
Right.
It's 1080p as the target for docked play, but it's dynamic going down to 540p with DLSS, obviously, scaling up to that target 1080p. And in a portable state, it's more aggressive, 756p going down to 380p. Again, DLSS reconstructing up to 756p. They also state that there's no differences between portable and docked besides the resolution difference there. And that does bear out in what I've tested. I've got a bunch of comparison shots here. Broadly, the detail level across the entire world is identical. Calm City, identical. With DLSS in place, there are some issues with hair, especially. I think mostly it's fine, but hair is the standout point.
Right.
Like Cloud's tuft, the chocobo feathers, when that's kind of put in close up, it definitely sticks out with a lot of dithering. And apparently, according to the interview, they tried to minimize that artifacting by adding a slight blur effect behind the element. It's still visible, I'd say, especially compared to like what PS5 is pushing, 4K image, native 4K image essentially. But that's one of the rougher points, I'd say, of the port overall, I think.
I would say that like it's interesting because you look at Remake's image quality, and I was quite fond of that game's image quality, and that game was using a variant of DLSS as well. And typically the figures that I was measuring, now I did not get comment from the developers in this, so it's entirely possible that the resolution ranges are similar. But in dock mode, I was getting 1080p typically. I was not seeing evidence of dynamic res, and I think the output there was 1080p as well with DLSS. And then in handheld play, I was seeing something like 720p internal typically, with maybe a bit more evidence of dynamic res. Now it's possible that was 756p as well there, but it was convincingly a 1080p like image. Now when I look at the version of Rebirth that we have here in this demo area, I think we're still seeing a pretty good 1080p like output in dock mode, but in portable mode, I mean, I'm seeing a pretty soft image, a softer looking image. So I suspect that there we're not actually seeing upsampling to the same degree as we were before, which makes sense given this game's comparatively much greater GPU demands, right? That all makes sense. But like, image quality to me in Remake was actually quite good and competitive with PS5. Here, I think we're seeing a bit less of that potentially, just in terms of the overall clarity, quality, aliasing of the presentation. I think it's a little bit worse. But overall, for a Switch 2 game, still pretty good. Like all things considered, considering the internal resolutions here that are being contemplated here, the output still looks reasonably good, I would have to say. But beyond image quality, we also have to look at performance, I think, which is, as expected, still targeting 30 FPS, but also as expected, a little rougher than Remake was on Switch 2, I think.
Yeah, it is. It's hard to ignore that there are hitches and one-frame blips along the road. It's not even exclusive to the Calm City. It's, that is there. You'll see in the marketplace area and while running around at any pace. There's some issues streaming in all the detail and the density of all the objects, despite all the cutbacks there. The NPC density as well is an issue. I would say it's not a sustained drop. Typically, it's usually to do with migrating from one place to the next, which does suggest maybe CPU memory or internal storage throughput. One of those three things could be culpable. If it was GPU, it'd be more of a sustained thing while looking at one scene. Or it could be simply the dynamic resolution working its magic and sort of needing a few frames to adjust to the rendering load on screen. I think it's okay. I think it's about what I expected. I didn't expect miracles. I think it's a very solid, playable rendition of the game, based on the demo anyway. I know not everyone's going to be on board with the hitches and just drops here and there, but I think I might give it a pass on this one because it is a PS5 Series X sort of gen title ported over, and I didn't expect the world from it. But it's very playable. Yeah,
I mean, it's always tough to score these games and tough to really consider them in their full context here on Switch 2, because the Switch 2 version is cut down considerably.
Yeah.
And it's mostly making up that performance deficit with the higher-end consoles by stripping back model density, model detail, obviously dealing with constraints like RAM allotment with reduced texture quality, things like this. Really stripping back resolution, shadow resolution, all kinds of cuts here. That all makes sense to me, but it still looks, broadly speaking, like the other versions of the games, because I think what they have going on here with primarily probably probe-based lighting, probe-based diffuse and direct lighting, and screen space reflections, and all that tech kind of scales well enough to Switch to. So with some other games, maybe we would see bigger apparent visual cuts just because their lighting systems just do not work on Switch 2 nearly as well as they do on the more advanced consoles. So I'm tending to see a large amount of quantitative cuts, but maybe less of those qualitative cuts that you mentioned in terms of the lighting quality that would be more dramatic, especially in thumbnails that people are posting to Twitter or whatever, doing their comparisons. But yeah, I think that overall, I'm much more pleased with Remake on Switch 2, but that's also to be expected given this game's pedigree and given what it was targeting originally. In general, I think this game has certain visual problems that are just exacerbated by Switch 2, and then certain visual problems that aren't fixed and aren't really changed in any respect. The game's diffuse and direct lighting is very similar, but obviously the game's issues with pop-in are more substantial, and issues with model quality, texture quality are more substantial on Switch 2, which does make sense. All right, but Tom, we also have some other platforms to take a look at here. First of all, Xbox Series S, cut price, pint-sized console from Microsoft. Oftentimes nowadays we're seeing it inherit a lot of the same concessions that we see on Switch 2 and the Switch 2 versions, which makes sense because they're both, both reduced in terms of their power relative to the more mainstream console offerings, the more premium console offerings. They also both have a large RAM deficit relative to those machines, so it makes sense that they would have similar settings in some respects in games like Pragmata, Resident Evil 9, things like that. But what kind of concessions are we seeing on Series S relative to Switch 2, relative to the other consoles. Is it basically a match for Switch 2, or is it something a little bit more premium?
It's a mixed bag, actually. Some things are a little bit better on Switch 2, others less so. I think broadly, Series S does have some advantages. Firstly, we're using the 30 FPS graphics mode on Series S because it's the comparison point in terms of the frame rate. And it's very similar in overall settings, I'd say. Textures use the same mushy, pixelated quality assets as Switch 2. Trees also don't animate, even on the graphics mode on Series S, so there's parity there. Shadow quality and that sort of rough draw distance pixelation that we see, the dithering, is also there on Series S and Switch 2 alike. The low quality volumetric fog is a match. So they belong in the same bracket, it's fair to say, in terms of the visual spec from the onset. There is, when we go to the outside, occasional grass placement differences in favor of Switch 2, but I think there's a degree of randomization there as well, which does make it kind of hard to give it like an absolute thumbs up. There are some geometry LODs which are custom tailored for Switch 2 as well, which I think does give it a slight advantage in some spots. But again, it's very sort of minor stuff. It really demands very close scrutiny to see what's there and what's missing. The Series S advantages, though, are kind of worth noting because Series S doesn't decimate the NPC animations at range on its graphics mode, but it does so on the performance mode. So there's no freezing at range for those NPCs.
Probably a much faster CPU there, right? So it makes sense they wouldn't have to make that concession. Yeah,
100%. Also, that nerfed water quality setting on Switch 2 doesn't apply for Series S, and you get higher quality water shader with more detailed ripple effects there. The final point is about image quality, and this has always been a bit of a sticking point for Series S versus Switch 2 comparisons, especially looking at the Capcom stuff you mentioned. There's always like, what does DLSS look like compared to TAA methods? And the 30 FPS graphics mode on Series S runs at 1080p with a more conventional TAA solution. And the upside there is it's generally pushing more pixels per frame than Switch 2, which is dynamic and leans heavily into that dynamic system. So in the end, that does mean hair treatment on Cloud, the Chocobos, all the rest is better on Series S. Neither approach is really ideal, but I think, Series S does have a win there. More broadly, Series S is softer when looking at across the horizon, across the grasslands, while Switch 2 is a lot more coarse, with a lot more pixelation on distant tree detail. Series S definitely suffers more from banding from that TAA. But yeah, that's the lowdown of how Series S runs on the quality mode. It's 1080p with those pros and cons. The performance mode, on the other hand, is cut back quite significantly, as we saw on the other machines. It looks like a lot of pixel counts come in at 540p with signs of 648p. So it's pretty hard to recommend based on image quality alone here. It's quite rough looking, and there are no visual differences between the modes otherwise. It's just that resolution cutback.
Frankly, I'm surprised that they didn't go back, and I mean, this is something that Square Enix, I think, has done with a lot of their games, but when they port them to new platforms, they don't really seem to go back and reevaluate their strategy for upscaling, even when they do have a TAAU available on PC, or like an FSR2, FSR3 available on PC. They don't go back and port that to the Xbox versions or something, even though it could make the experience look, I think, a lot better here than we're seeing on Series S with its like 540p internal resolution, which is being smeared with that classic UE4 TAA. Does not look very good in a 4K set. Does not really look very good on anything. Looks extremely rough in the shots that I've seen. So yeah, cannot recommend that myself. And I am not surprised, frankly, that Switch 2 is kind of coming head to head with Series S in some key visual respects with respect to its image quality, because DLSS is just a much better anti-aliaser, much better upscaler than I think UE4's TAA is at the kinds of resolutions that we're contemplating here. So for sure, that makes a lot of sense to me. But performance, that's the kind of key question on Series S. So are we actually getting a good 60 FPS, good 30 FPS, and are there any unexpected issues that may have arisen in this code that we might want to point out today?
You've read the notes.
Yes,
Yes, there are. The good news is that 30 FPS graphics mode is the one to pick, I think, and I would honestly just go for that personally. The 30 FPS cap is right on, and I haven't seen any drops so far in the first 2 chapters. Not to say it won't later on, but it's very rock solid, and I think that's the trend across most versions of this on the main consoles, Xbox and PS5. The performance mode is more of like the experimental mode in that regard, like, or you could say the VRR mode. On Xbox Series S, there's obviously 2 variations of it. There's the smooth and sharp. I've gone with sharp here. It's not an entirely locked experience. It's not terrible by any means. It's dropping into the high 50s during combat and around calm. What does seem odd, though, is there's judder. It's very strange. Like, even when it's 60 FPS on the graph, it's still stuttering, like as if the camera is moving at different rates, different velocities between each update of each frame.
Right.
And it's a judder that is impossible to ignore in the demo state that we have right now.
Yeah, this is actually an issue that I've noted in some Unreal Engine 5 titles going back quite a ways. Probably the first example that I saw, which was also my very first video that I've ever did for DF, was in the Ghost Runner version for Series S, where, yeah, the game would run at 60 FPS, but it would run with this really inconsistent camera travel between frames, which made it appear like it was running at a lower frame rate update, I would say.
Yeah.
And then also, I think John noted in the initial Xbox versions of High on Life, this was also an issue. I think they've spotted it a couple times subsequent to that, but yeah, just a big issue. Looks awful, happens in Unreal Engine games, seemingly, especially UE4 titles. Really not very good. I cannot recommend playing a game with this kind of problem. Also noticed it, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, and I think the Series S version of Hogwarts Legacy, that title has a 60 frames per second mode with this issue. But obviously we have another Xbox console, Xbox Series X. We probably expect that to be fairly similar to PS5 because it almost invariably is.
Yeah.
But obviously we have another chance for the same performance-related camera travel issues to recur there. So what's the kind of general lay of the land on Series X? Basically the same as PS5, or are there any notable exceptions?
There's a few twists, yeah. There's yeah, in the demo version at least, the graphics mode runs at 4K, similar to PS5, which is great news, 30 FPS as well. The performance mode is a little bit different from my testing, in that it runs from 1080p to 1368p, which is higher than what we noted on PS5. I think you had 1152p on record. I found some at 1260p, but it never gets as high as Series X on base PS5. So the result is, if we do like close zooms on the performance modes on each, there is a slightly sharper image on the performance modes there on both on the Series X version. And you'll also notice geometry and tree LOD advantages here and there, not major, but they are there on Series X in matching shots across the horizon. So there are higher settings on Series X and a slightly higher resolution. Nothing comes for free though, and performance has been noted by people, and it's true. Series X does have issues in performance that are not there on base PS5. So I've tried this in calm, where we're running around the center, going through the marketplace. There are drops all over the place on Series X in the performance mode that are just not there on base PS5. And going to the grasslands area, it's going down to 50, high 40s, where it's just mostly a clean 60 on PS5. But a lot of that can be cleaned up by VRR. It's almost the cliche that I come up with for a lot of videos these days, but it's very true. Developers are increasingly leaning on VRR to clean up the lack of optimization in some of their games. That's true of the demo, at least for Series X. Now, the problem on top of that is, just like Series S, there's the camera stutter issue. So even when it's at 60, it just doesn't feel great. It still hitches and there's no fluid motion to camera movement.
Yeah, I think it's awful. I just think they need to fix it. I mean, it's a demo, so I don't have sky-high expectations. But as your first kind of like visual experience of this game, I just think it makes the game look terrible. I mean, I do have to emphasize that it's not good. The occasional frame rate drop I can forgive, especially if you're using VRR. Obviously, that isn't so noticeable always. But if you're dealing with this constant camera stutter issue in all content, much bigger issue here on Series X. So cannot advise that. But yeah, the resolution being a little bit higher, that's not too unexpected, I guess, because this game does use a dynamic resolution that seems to vary up quite a bit. So between identical shots, you can probably get some pretty significant, if not huge, resolution advantages on Series X, but decreased performance level plus this issue with the camera travel, I mean, it's just hard to forgive at this point, so hopefully they do wrap that up.
Not a great first impression if this is your first exposure to the game on the demo. Yeah.
So overall, just to wrap up here, Tom, what do you kind of make of the game on Switch 2 and on Xbox Series, and just overall? I mean, I think that like the Switch 2 version, good port so far, definitely cut back in some significant ways, but seems like a reasonably credible, high-quality port that does translate most of the PS5 experience to Switch 2, for better or for worse. I mean, it's mostly the same visual experience overall, I would say, just cut down qualitatively in terms of like, you know, resolution, WODs, textures, etc., etc. We've discussed that to death already. So it is like a less refined experience, but it's still very much the same experience. Xbox Series, a little bit more problematic with the camera travel issue if that ships in the final game. I think that's kind of like really hard to forgive in terms of presentation on Series X. I really hope that gets cleaned up. Granted, it's only in the 60 FPS mode, so if you do prefer those higher fidelity 30 FPS modes, yes, perhaps you might, especially on Series S. Not so much of an issue there. But yeah, overall, seems like a good port of a pretty interesting current generation title. Maybe not the most visually advanced in every respect. Obviously, it's using Unreal Engine 4. As is the next, to my chagrin, as is the next Final Fantasy Remake series game. They're sticking with UE4, which probably does not portend such positive things for the game's like diffuse indirect lighting quality or anything like that. But, you know, hopefully it'll be a better experience than Rebirth in at least some of those respects. So yeah, what are your thoughts overall on the game on Switch 2, on Series X, Series S? What do you think about it?
The Xbox situation is like pretty clear cut. I don't want it to ship like that for people who want to use the performance mode, but it is, you know, 30 FPS modes are absolutely fine. Like, and they do look good. Right. Series S is taking a few cutbacks more than I expected in some areas, shadows especially, but you know, we've seen it before compared to Switch 2, how that kind of pans out. It's in the same bracket again. The Switch 2 stuff is really where the interest is, the point of interest for me, because it's such a unique spec, and having a portable version of Rebirth makes it unique. Playing it in handheld mode is genuinely a surprise to me. I didn't think it would run. My expectations weren't high, but it's running a lot better than I expected, if that makes sense, despite the frame rate drops in there. So yeah, I think the icing on the cake here would be if it did have cross saves with the other versions, like so you could take it away, enjoy the game on the move, and then come back and upload your save to a sort of a unified save system that you could play on PS5. Yeah, as it is, it's very enjoyable. Like I could enjoy this version as it is.
But yeah, I think that's probably going to do it for this video, wouldn't you say so, Tom? I think that's probably enough for us today. So
yeah, for a demo.
For a demo, yeah, we still got to cover the full game in about a month here. But yeah, this is a pretty decent slice of the full game for us to talk about. So if you did enjoy this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at patreon.com/digitalfoundry for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, use social media. And from Tom and Oliver, signing off.